Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It's now 9:08 p.m. in a very grim, extremely cold, very inhospitable Budapest. The days are stubbornly, brutally short, and spring is as far away as it has been for months and months and months. But on a more cheerful, uplifting note, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. It is time for our Thursday live stream. And there's a lot to talk about. And, usually I talk about, what time is it on the East Coast of the United States? It is, of course, 3:09 p.m. on the East Coast. And as we might have expected, the Democrats have moved with alacrity in the courts to try to stop Trump's various initiatives. So the buyout plan of offering people a lump sum civil servants a lump sum to leave, and then the Doge plan of reforming the government, all of which are now the courts have ruled or put a temporary block on these Trump initiatives. That was always to expect, and of course, there's also the temporary block on the birthright citizenship proposal. That one will obviously end up in the Supreme Court because it's a very fundamental decision, and the Supreme Court really needs to address it. I mean, it's been a long time in the making, and the Supreme Court will have to address it, and that's just that's going to end up there sometime, probably within the next 12 months. So that was always fairly predictable. I mean, what wasn't predictable was Trump's very imaginative and aggressive foreign policy moves. I mean, obviously, his threats against Panama, that he's going to seize the canal, his threats against Denmark, that he's going to take Greenland, and then I suppose his threats against Canada, that he intends to make Canada the 51st state of the United States. So that really wasn't predicted, because he never mentioned that at any point during the 2024 campaign. And then, of course, the most startling was what we discussed in our podcast with Peter yesterday, was his announcement on Tuesday with Netanyahu that he intends to take over Gaza. He's now elaborated on it a little further on his Truth Social page, whereby Israel would clean out Gaza, clean out in the sense that Israel would decisively defeat Hamas, and then somehow, presumably, to remove the Palestinians. So it would be up to Israel to remove the Palestinian inhabitants of the Gaza. So where America comes into this plan, even though on Tuesday he talked about the United States taking over Gaza, but he never really specified exactly at what stage this is going to happen. Now it seems like Israel will do the heavy lifting, first defeating Hamas, and then second, removing the Palestinian residents. Now, and then at that stage, Israel would hand over Gaza to the United States that will then move ahead and clear the rubble, and start rebuilding, reconstruction, and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East, which is where Trump and Steve Witkoff come in with their extensive experience of real estate development. Now, uh, the the tricky part of it is obviously the how do you remove the Palestinian residents who obviously have no intention of leaving. They make clear that they have no intention of leaving. You know, even after all that Israel has done, even after all the bombing, the destruction, the years of blockade, after all of that, they still insist on going back to their homes or what's left of them. So it would be up to Israel then, of course, to carry out this ethnic cleansing campaign. Whether the United States would help with this ethnic cleansing project, I mean, that isn't clear. The Trump insists that there'll be no U.S. troops involved, so no boots on the ground, which is quite interesting in the sense that he, you know, if he's trying to present this bold, aggressive, imperialist vision of America, it's very strange that he also uh, it adds to that the kind of post-Vietnam caveat of every American president. Well, no boots on the ground. No, 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 no boots. No, no, no. We're not going to go down there. No, no, no Vietnams. No boots on the ground. So it's a strangely timid approach by Trump, because at least George W. Bush, you know, put his money where his mouth is. I mean, he sent American forces into Iraq. So Trump makes this proposal that he's going to remove the 1.8 million Palestinians. Again, I mean, other people have pointed out it's interesting where he gets this 1.8 million number from, because all previous estimates of the population of Gaza had 2.1 million as the number of residents of Gaza. So interesting that it's not 2.1 million. He says it's 1.8 million, which would suggest that whoever gave him these numbers has written off 300,000. Now, maybe they're now assuming 300,000 Palestinians have been killed, or maybe 300,000 have fled elsewhere. I don't know where they would flee, because all other ports of exit have been closed to them. So it's not like they can go and flee somewhere else. So again, it suggests, first of all, that Israel will do the ethnic cleansing. He says he said no American forces are going to be involved. But then you have to address the next problem, which is where exactly are the Palestinians to go to? Because he talks about, well, I mean, 1 place, 2 places, 4 places, 8 places, 12 places, you know, beautiful, beautiful, absolutely beautiful places that the Palestinians of Gaza can go to. Well, where are they? And who's going to provide them these beautiful places for the Palestinians? We know that Egypt and Jordan have flatly refused. Now, Trump obviously is suggesting that, well, that doesn't really matter, because Egypt and Jordan are wholly owned subsidiaries of the United States, and so therefore all the United States needs to do is to threaten each of those countries with the withholding of funds, and that will bring them to heel. Well, the problem with that argument that the sums involved are not enough. I mean, let's say that United States gives $4 billion a year to Egypt. Okay, that's a decent enough sum. But how much would it cost Egypt, though, if it were to house, whatever, a few 100,000 Palestinians from Gaza? It would come to a hell of a lot more than 4 billion. And I don't mean, well, the United States would give Egypt another 4, 5, 6 billion in order to house the the Palestinians in the Sinai, because that may well be what Trump has in mind. He'll give you, we'll give you whatever. Name a sum. We'll write a check for you to rehouse the Palestinians in the Sinai. But even if Egypt were to accept that, first of all, it would cause enormous turmoil within Egyptian society, suddenly bringing in I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. But, and obviously, this will be deeply unpopular, since Egypt will have accepted and taken part in an ethnic cleansing campaign, something every single Egyptian leader, all the way back to King Farouk, during the time of the war in 1947-48, all the way back to King Farouk, had said they would never accept it. They would never accept any kind of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So that's everyone: King Farouk, Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, Sisi. Not one of them would ever accept this. So it seems very unlikely. But more seriously, the moment the Palestinians decamped to Sinai, they would start up a war against Israel. They would immediately. I mean, they do it even on the way to Sinai. They would already be planning the resumption of a war against Israel, and therefore Israel will in no time at all be launching its wars against the Palestinians in the Sinai, which means that they would be launching wars against Egypt. This will be Egyptian territory, and Israel would be launching attacks against Egypt. Nothing new there. Israel used to do that during the 1950s. Causing a great deal of distress to Nasser, because Nasser kind of saw this as a deliberate act of provocation. It was an attempt by Israel to goad Egypt into a war. Nasser didn't want to go there, but on the other hand, it made Egypt look weak and humiliated by these constant attacks on Sinai by Israel. So this would be much more ferocious, because this would be a Palestinian army that would be getting missiles from somewhere and be planning to resume their war against Israel. As long as Palestinians are in existence, they will be fighting against Israel. I mean, it's just not, they're not going to accept Israeli persecution. So therefore, Sisi has to calculate. Okay, you give me, we get our $4 billion a year annually, and then we give you to Egypt. We give you another 4 billion, 5 billion, maybe 10 billion to rehouse these the Palestinians. Okay, but how much will Egypt end up paying through the civil war probably breaking out in Egypt over this displaced Palestinian population, and through this constant attacks by Israel? And so it's not really worth it. So any responsible Egyptian leader, and I assume Sisi is, will say, look, okay, take your damn 4 billion, because it just isn't worth it for us to take part in this plan. And it's quite likely that Saudi Arabia would then step up to the plate and say, well, whatever money Egypt will have given up to from given up because it stood up to Trump. Well, we'll make up for it. We'll make up the shortfall. We chip in 2-3 billion. United Arab Emirates chips in a couple of million, and maybe some other Gulf states will also chip in some money, so they can make good on whatever Egypt loses as a result of not going along with Trump's plan. So I think Egypt isn't going to do it. I think Jordan, which remembers very well, and King Abdullah was alive during the 1970s civil war in Jordan, which came about as a result of the flight of the Palestinians in the aftermath of the 1967 war. That there was a ferocious war to rule Jordan, and King Hussein was on the brink of losing that civil war, and he ultimately had to call in the United States, and the United States basically bailed him out, and King Hussein survived, the civil war. And of course, he committed these massacres against the Palestinians, and hence the start of the movement, the Black September, which was September 1970. But King Abdullah was alive then, so he will have some memories of that civil war, and that's why I think he would be very reluctant to take in any Palestinian refugees, because he doesn't want to share the fate of his father. So again, I don't see Jordan, I don't see Saudi Arabia, I don't see any Arab state going along with it. So then the question arises, what was Trump thinking when he suggested this? Again, whatever else you could say about Trump, he's not a fool. I know people always suggest that he is and so on, but he's not. He's a very shrewd guy. He's been around a long time. He's basically, in a very, he did well in a very cutthroat business. Real estate in New York. You don't get anywhere by being a fool in that world. Casinos in New Jersey, again, you don't get very far being a fool there. So what is Trump playing at? Now, it's very hard to get into his mind, but I tend to think that it's of a piece with his negotiating strategy, which is to terrify his adversaries that he's going to do this horrible thing, and get his adversaries to say, oh my God, we don't want to go there. We don't want to get into this confrontation with Trump. Let's just settle for something. It's still better than the alternative. And so when he puts this forward, hey, why don't we just ethnically cleanse Gaza? Just remove all the Palestinians. That's a way extreme position, but in Trump's mind, that might serve to focus the attention of the Arab states and come up with some remedy that Trump could then say, okay, well, that's it. We can accept this arrangement for Gaza. See, the problem has been since October the 7th, which is, well, okay, you first of all have to defeat Hamas, which is quite difficult. And but let's say in principle Israel could defeat Hamas. Um, even if you can't defeat Palestinian resistance, you can defeat Hamas. Okay, but what happens then? What's the plan then? Now you've got all those horrible creatures, those Smotriches and Ben-Gvirs, who say, yeah, well, what then? We just get rid of the Palestinians, move them out. In other words, the basic plan put forward by Trump. Yeah, we just get rid of them. Okay. Now that's still a minority position in Israel. I'm not sure, that there's really a consensus within Israel to undertake what would, in effect, be a horrific ethnic cleansing campaign. It clearly would be genocide. I mean, I think most international jurists would deem this genocide. I mean, when you just pick people up, lock, stock, and barrel, and do it. Keep in mind, no one has done anything like this since World War II. I mean, people talk about Nakba. This would, of course, Nakba would, I think, pale in comparison with this. I mean, the sheer numbers are so extraordinary, and at the same time, you would have to do it in the face of opposition from other states. In other words, other states are refusing to accept any of these, artificially generated, coerced refugees. So, so I don't know whether the Israeli society would go along with that, but nonetheless, okay. But we can leave that aside for the moment, and then think in terms of, okay, well, if that solution isn't a viable one, what's an alternative? And Netanyahu has absolutely refused at any time since October the 7th to outline a some kind of a plan for Gaza. Just saying, oh, well, we can't have Hamas there. Okay, we can't have Hamas there. But who would be acceptable? Would the Palestinian Authority be acceptable? No, Palestinian Authority not acceptable. No. We can't have the Palestinian Authority. But then who? And then of course there's talk. Well, maybe some consortium of Arab states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, maybe the United Nations taking part. Netanyahu hasn't accepted that, and it's very unlikely that any of the Arab states would take part in any consortium to run Hamas, run Gaza, because ultimately you would still have to make the decision as to, well, who's going to do the day-to-day administration? I mean, who's going to run whatever post offices? Who's going to run refuse collection? Who's going to run the local clinics? I mean, Egypt isn't going to do that. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not going to do that. So ultimately, who's going to do it? And then obviously it's going to be Hamas or the offshoots of Hamas. And so Netanyahu says, well, okay, well, we can't have Hamas, so we're not going to accept anything. And so this is where I think Trump's plan, what if you could call it that, comes in, is that he presents this as okay, well, yeah, I'm going, this is this is an interesting alternative. Why don't we just get rid of the Palestinians, move them somewhere, we'll give them beautiful homes, beautiful gardens somewhere. By doing that, I think he's maybe trying to coerce the Arab states who basically just refuse to go along with any of these Israeli projects. And so maybe to get them to agree, essentially, to take over Gaza. Some way they're going to take over Gaza, and that they would ensure that no one with any Hamas connection would get anywhere. In other words, he's doing this to terrify the Arab states that he really means it. He really is going to have, the Americans are going to back a plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They're actually going to back that plan, and so to avoid that, hey, well, let's see if we can just do something, because at least whatever we do, we sign on to something. It's better than the than the alternative, and then he can just coerce. That's how he's thinking. He can coerce Saudi Arabia, which is the prize. He can coerce Saudi Arabia into joining the Abraham Accords without giving Saudi Arabia has made clear, well, we're not going to join the Abraham Accords unless there's some movement towards the two-state solution. That's what he said. That's their condition. We won't join the Abraham Accords unless we make some movement towards a two-state solution, and the two-state solution involves the West Bank and Gaza, the territories, those two territories comprising a future Palestinian state. But if Trump then says, well, okay, well, that's not really viable. What? I think I might go along with this Israeli plan to throw out all the Palestinians. Then maybe sort of, well, that will act as the incentive, at least in Trump's mind. I'm not saying that will work. I mean, in Trump's mind, that will act as an incentive to get the Saudis to say, no, we'll help in setting up some kind of an interim administration in Gaza, and we will join the Abraham Accords, recognize Israel, just as long as you don't ethnically cleanse Gaza. So in other words, he's using this as a way to coerce the Arab states into going along with the Abraham Accords and with agreeing to run Gaza on an interim basis, jointly with Israel. Now, I don't think this is doable. I'm skeptical of that this can work, but I think that's may well be how Trump is thinking. That you just put this out there. It's so horrific. It's so terrifying that the idea of the United States breaking essentially 57 years of policy on Gaza. After all, remember, this is occupied territory. According to all these UN Security Council resolutions, this is territory from which Israel is supposed to have withdrawn. And then according to UN Security Council resolutions, it was supposed to comprise a future Palestinian state with West Jerusalem as the capital. So here's Trump threatening to throw all that into the waste paper basket. And so frightening it is that somehow the Saudis and the Egyptians are just going to go, all right, this is awful. We'll go along with some plan. We'll run Gaza for you. We'll with you and with Israel. We'll help you out, just so long as you don't try this insane, horrific ethnic cleansing campaign. So that's I think what the way Trump is thinking. Again, I'm not saying this is a formula for a successful policy, and I was saying Trump, this is going to work, but I think that that's what he's thinking. I'm not buying the idea that suddenly Trump has become this ardent Zionist, and he's suddenly swallowed all the idea of Mike Huckabee and Mark Levin and all these fanatics. That's just not. I don't think that's what Trump is about. Um, but he is, I think, pragmatic, and this is how he negotiates. Again, I'm not saying this is a good way to negotiate. I don't think it is a good way to negotiate. But I think but he thinks that, hey, that's peace through strength. I like to terrify people. That's the famous, the madman theory of foreign policy. I think he's going to try and do something similar with Russia, also in Ukraine. I think he's going to see if he can get Russia to to the negotiating table by threatening to absolutely escalate American involvement, throw all manner of goodies and hardware Ukraine's way, in the hope that this was going to focus minds in Moscow. Again, I'm not sure that that's going to work, but I think that's how he's going to he's going to try it, because I think that's how he sees diplomacy. He's not a traditional diplomat, but he thinks, okay, well, I do this, I frighten my adversaries by warning them of terrifying consequences if they don't go along with my plan, and then we get something. I mean, we've seen this in action. I mean, again, with his use of tariffs. So he comes along with his theory of tariffs, a very sound theory, which I would have gone along with, which is, hey, we're going to use tariffs, which is what in American history we use tariffs as a protective barrier behind which our industries can thrive, grow, and become world economic dynamos, which I think that's a very sound theory. However, he hasn't done that. He's used tariffs in order to coerce Mexico and Canada. And when he gets some concessions, extracts concessions from Mexico and Canada, he says, okay, you know what, I'm going to postpone the tariffs, which of course goes against the original theory, which I think is a serious theory. It means that he's just using it as a negotiating ploy. But that's not kind of what he said during the campaign, which is, hey, I'm going to use tariffs in order to make American industries the strongest that they have ever been. We will once again be the industrial powerhouse of the world. So that's I think that's what he's going to try and do. One other thing, what I wanted to talk about was this article. I mentioned this on Tuesday. This article by Sergei Lavrov. It's on the Kremlin, no, not on the Russian Foreign Ministry website, in which he was talking about the Yalta and Potsdam agreements and the world that they created, and then of course he got on to his favorite topic, which is multipolarity. Now, I know everybody loves to bend the knee to Sergei Lavrov, man of culture, wisdom, foresight, eloquence, humor, and but the interesting thing is when people say these things about him, I mean, I don't know him personally, and he certainly comes across as a very intelligent man, cultivated and so on, but they don't really measure, which is how you should always measure any foreign ministers. Well, what foreign policy successes have you accomplished? I mean, yeah, that you're witty and that you've read a lot of books and you have some wisdom. I mean, that's a given. I mean, but what about your foreign policy? And the problem with that article is that he's got everything back to front. And we touched on this with Peter when we were talking on Monday, I think, about Yalta. We didn't touch on Potsdam, but with the Yalta agreements, because this is uh, the 80th anniversary of the meetings at Yalta. And what Yalta enshrined was essentially a post post-war order in which there would be a consensus among the great powers. And if you have the consensus among the great powers, then you can avoid wars. As long as you respect the prerogatives of the great powers, you avoid wars. Now, one aspect of Yalta, and this has been going on through the World War II negotiations, was the creation of the United Nations. Now, the Soviet Union under Stalin wasn't really particularly enthusiastic about the UN because obviously they had bad memories of the League of Nations and thought of the United Nations would be yet another international body in which the Western powers would gang up against the Soviet Union. But the Americans were very insistent on this, and the question then arose: well, all right, we can have the United Nations, but how do you avoid the United Nations essentially becoming a mechanism for ganging up on someone else? And this is what the Soviet Union was very concerned about, because they saw, well, there's the United States, there's the United Kingdom, there's France, and they will always be ganging up on us in the United Nations. So how are we going to avoid that? And then the Soviets, Stalin, came up with the solution, which was the veto of the permanent member states having a veto. The Americans weren't very keen on that. I mean, in part they accepted the veto, but only on enforcement actions, that the great powers would have a veto, the permanent members have a veto, but not on other things. But Stalin insisted not on everything. The permanent members would have the veto on whatever issue that they wanted to veto. And that's what made the United Nations a success, because what by introducing the veto, you recognized the prerogative of the great powers, and then you ensure that the United Nations cannot be used to gang up on another state. And once the British and the Americans agreed to the veto, the permanent member states veto on any issue that the permanent member decided. There were no restrictions on when and where you can use the veto. And then they accepted it because that was the condition of Soviet involvement in the United Nations. And that, in effect, meant that the United Nations recognized the prerogatives of the great powers and basically said, we're not going to gang up against one of the great powers. We can gang up against the non-great powers. That's not a problem. We can always do that, but we can't gang up against a great power. Now, the problem, Lavrov doesn't seem to understand this. I mean, just read this article. It's on the website. Instead, Lavrov said, "Oh, United Nations, fantastic! Great accomplishment. The United Nations Charter, the sovereign equality of states, and then and that. Whereas the Americans, with a rules-based order, they were ignoring the sovereign equality of states, the outlawing of aggression and so on." But yes, it's true that the United Nations Charter does indeed recognize the sovereign equality of states, and it doesn't, and it's true that the United Nations Charter outlaws aggression. And declares that and there've been any number of other General Assembly resolutions condemning aggression. But the point was that's just platitudes. I mean, you can, that's nice, great. You have a charter and everyone signs on to this charter and says yes, sovereign equality of states, and aggression is outlawed. But those things have been done before. I mean, the League of Nations, that it also outlawed aggression. The Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawed aggression. There's nothing new about that. What made the United Nations distinctive was the veto powers. And that meant that you can have an institution that could work, because as long as a great power could think, well, that you're never going to gang up on us, you're never going to use this institution against us, we can take part in it. If for one moment any great power thought, hey, they're just ganging up on us, they would just walk away. Great power would walk away, just as the great powers walked away from the League of Nations. That was what was distinctive about those agreements. Lavrov completely misses the plot, because Lavrov insists that the issue was the sovereign equality of states and the outlawing of aggression. That was not distinctive. That was not of any interest whatsoever. Those are just those platitudes. Because of course, great powers are always going to be aggressive. They're always going to wage aggressive wars. I mean, of course they do. Because great powers will have their interest. What great powers, ideally do is that they wage aggressive wars against non-great powers, and therefore they can guarantee that they will win. What great powers shouldn't do, is to wage wars against other great powers, because that's the fastest way of ceasing to be a great power. And everybody has known this, and by and large, states follow that rule, which is, great powers don't go to war against one another, because that way lies catastrophe. So the point about the rules-based order, what's obnoxious about the rules-based order, Lavrov is right, it's obnoxious because you're using a very arbitrary set of rules to gang up against someone else. The United Nations will say, no, you can't gang up against a great power. And when he kind of, Lavrov points out, oh, Trump, I don't like all this talk about America first. It reminds me of, you guessed it, Deutschland über alles. Germany above everyone. So he says, he goes there. It's like, on every side, everything is always about Hitler. Whatever, whether it's Russia, the United States, Israel, it's always about Hitler. But that's missing the point. I mean, one doesn't have to admire Trump or like Trump or anything, or, like Trump's policy. America first is a perfectly rational policy in theory, which is that America will pursue its own national interest and will not be hampered by the all kinds of agendas and alliances of others. Now, one would think that a foreign minister of Russia would actually welcome this and said, "Yeah, well, okay, well, I understand America first. You basically your priorities will be, well, what is good for America, and that's what you're going to do." But instead, Lavrov essentially criticizes that position by invoking some, a version of the rules-based order of the United Nations. Oh no, well, you can't go around pursuing your own national interest because you've got to think about the world community. You got to think about the UN Charter, the United Nations. You can't, this is no good. So he's kind of sounding like some version of Biden and Blinken in criticizing the position of Trump. But the point is that any kind of time you say America first, and that goes back to the America first movement between the wars, which was, well, we're not going to get into other people's conflicts. We're not going to get involved. These conflicts have nothing to do with us. That was the position of Charles Lindbergh. We did a podcast on Lindbergh. I can't remember when it was, about a year ago, whatever. And that was the point. I mean, Lindbergh is always identified as somehow pro-fascist and whatnot. But he wasn't. He wasn't pro-fascist. He wasn't, he didn't admire Hitler. But he said America should only be concerned with what's good for America. No entangling alliances, no interference in other countries' internal affairs, no preoccupation with other countries' borders or other countries' internecine conflicts. We're only interested in what's good for America. And that view, I think, is closer to the spirit of the wartime agreements than this nonsense idea that somehow we go, we got to think about the global community, and we got to think about all those the sovereign equality of states. Stalin never thought about that. If you go back to the wartime agreements, and that's what Lavrov is talking about, he's talking about Yalta and Potsdam. If you go back to the wartime agreements, Stalin's preoccupation was the Soviet Union first. Which was, hey, we need to ensure that where our western borders will be, so we're going to move Poland, westward. The Baltic states, absolutely incorporate them within the USSR. Poland, we need a friendly government in Poland. We're not going to tolerate a return to the pre-war regimes in Poland that were always plotting a war against the Soviet Union. We're not going to go back to that. Bulgaria, Romania, they're going to be run by communists. Eventually, Stalin then moved and have communists running Czechoslovakia and Hungary, though that wasn't immediately obvious during the the wartime conferences. And then, of course, and other things that he absolutely insisted on to ensure Soviet interest. Finland, absolutely neutrality for Finland. Finland could not join any hostile military alliances. The Turkish Straits, he wanted a settlement on the issue of the Turkish Straits. You can't have Turkey in control of a crucial waterway. He didn't get his way on that, but that was a major preoccupation of his. So in other words, what the Soviet Union was doing in those wartime negotiations was the Soviet Union first. That's what the Soviet leaders were doing. That they wanted to ensure that the Soviet Union will never again find itself in a vulnerable position as it did in June 1941. Now, within that, they said, okay, well, we'll work with the United Nations, and as long as we can ensure that this United Nations will not be under the control of other powers, and that the United Nations is not going to be used to gang up against us. So this was a Soviet Union first policy. Lavrov brought that up. I didn't bring it up. Lavrov brought up the Yalta and Potsdam, and then took from that. The great achievement of Yalta and Potsdam was the establishment of the United Nations, the UN Charter, the sovereign equality of states, and and so on. And that states will not be involved in selfish actions. You're going to be thinking about all this. So he sounds like one of these do-gooders. You listen to about about this UN program and that UN program, but that wasn't what the Yalta and Potsdam were about. As I say, the UN came about through the wartime agreements. Wasn't specifically at Yalta and Potsdam, though they were discussed, but it was the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, and then the first meeting of the UN in San Francisco. But the question was, to declare that that if you pursue your own interests and say, well, we're not really thinking about what other countries are doing, we're pursuing America first, that this is somehow reminiscent of Deutschland über alles. I mean, apart from anything else, he's Lavrov, the cultured, cultivated, sophisticated man, should know that Deutschland über alles really has nothing to do with Hitler. I mean, that it long predated Hitler, and it was the words were had nothing to do with Hitler. I mean, it's just it's a kind of lazy declaration that somehow this had anything to do with Nazism. So to link anything that the Trump thing with Deutschland, with Hitler, as I say, Deutschland über alles doesn't have anything to do with Hitler, predated Hitler, and so if we're talking about the wartime agreements, why they were successful was they recognized the prerogatives of the great powers, and the great powers will always pursue, above all else, their own national interest. And that, I assume, is what Russia is doing when it launched its the so-called special military operation. It declared that this that this is our vital, existential, national interest. And we really don't care what other people think about this. We don't care what the United States thinks about it. We don't care what the United Kingdom thinks about it. It's our vital national interest. Is it a violation of the international law? Maybe. Probably. And that's what you have to do. Yeah, okay. It may well be violation of international law. Tough. We are a great power, and our vital national interests are at stake, and we're going to do whatever we need to do to ensure our interest. And that's what the Soviet Union did. Again, they set up, you say, the Yalta and Potsdam. They set up these the United Nations, whatever, the UN Charter. But did the Soviet Union follow the UN Charter? Did it follow the UN Charter when it intervened in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 68, Afghanistan in 79? I don't think so. I mean, you look at the UN Charter. I don't think so. Was it in accord with international law? Probably not. Um, but it's a great power, and the great powers have to do whatever they have to do, and they have to ensure that other great powers respect the prerogatives of, of those permanent members of the UN Security Council. This seems to be fairly obvious points, and for him to say, "Oh, the great achievement of Yalta was the United Nations, the UN Charter," I, I think it's a complete misreading of the wartime agreements, particularly, particularly when you look through those negotiations and how insistent the Soviets were, and that included Stalin, Molotov, Gromyko, how insistent they were that their vital national interests were recognized. And I listed some of them. That's what they were preoccupied with. And then they said, okay, fine, we'll go along with your plan for the United Nations as long as you don't use this to gang up on us. And then they said, we will only join if we have the permanent members, in other words, the great powers, have the veto. So I think Lavrov is just missing the plot here. Anyway, let's then take a look at our locals page, which is our the contributors who make sure that that the dogs are kept on a leash, because they're not in a good mood. This cold weather doesn't please them, and when they stare at that tip jar and they say, "Yeah, what the hell's going on here?" and then they take it out on me. So that's not a. So I really appreciate the gagglers who are sort of, okay, well, just keep the dogs away from him. Anyway, so here we have Marx 2023 says, just check out Bannon with rabbi friends. Bannon is 100% Zionist, just as Trump and his regime. Yeah, I mean, I think you're referring to this rabbi. I don't know his name. He was on the other day with him. He often has these rabbis on him, and his thesis was that all the violations of international law with Israel and Palestine are being perpetrated by Egypt and Jordan. And how are they violating international law? Well, because they're keeping their borders closed to Palestinians. I mean, can you imagine sort of the sheer outrageous dishonesty of this argument? So that somehow Egypt and Jordan are obligated to take the Palestinians. These poor Palestinian refugees, they're fleeing what they're fleeing from. That, of course, the rabbi didn't go into. But somehow Egypt, in closing this border, is in violation of innumerable United Nations resolutions. It's in violation of of all the refugees, international refugees legislation, and so those are the real criminals. Egypt, it is inhuman, and he could just presumably go all the way to so the Hitlerian and whatever, because they are closing their borders to the Palestinians. I mean, can you imagine the gall, the insolence of saying that these Palestinians who are fleeing from Israeli bombs, and who's at fault here? At fault here is Egypt by closing the borders. Now, of course, he doesn't address and neither does Bannon, who seemed to go along with all of this. I mean, Bannon invited him as to why Egypt what kept the border closed. Well, because Egypt doesn't want to take part in this ethnic cleansing, because Egypt knows perfectly well that if it opened the border and there was the Palestinians were driven to cross the border, that's it. They wouldn't be allowed to go back, because Egypt knows perfectly well that this is the Israeli plan. The Israeli plan is to drive out the Palestinians from Gaza, and it wants no part of this. You see, this is always being used as an argument against the Arabs by this rabbi guy. That somehow the Arabs are so cruel. They are the ones who are treating the Palestinians so horribly. They're cruel, inhuman, unjust, unlike we Israelis, because they refuse to take in the Palestinians. And even when they have Palestinians, they refuse to grant them citizenship. Oh, imagine that. They're not granting them citizenship. Well, of course, they're not doing it because they know that that's the plan. They're not going to take part in the ethnic cleansing plan. This has been the Israeli plan all along, and then they're simply not going to do it. And because they want to retain their right to insist on a state for the Palestinians. If they started granting citizenship, then that's it. They basically, the Palestinians wouldn't have any legitimate claim for a state of their own. Well, what do you need a state for? You're a citizen of Libya. What do you need a state for? You're a citizen of Egypt. You're a citizen of Morocco. That's it. And that's, of course, what the Israeli plan: drive them out, make them live in other Arab countries, and then these Arab countries will be obligated, according to international law, to grant them citizenship. And once they've got citizenship, then hey, you don't have any standing to demand a state for the Palestinians. And so when Egypt, Jordan, or any of the other Arab states don't go along with this Israeli plan, on comes this rabbi to talk about how they're in violation of international law. Imagine that's the they're the real criminals. They're the ones who are really persecuting the Palestinian. And Bannon just goes along with that. And so, appalling this is. Again, because Bannon postures as America first. Always America first. Well, by identifying yourself with the most extreme elements within Israel, and then, of course, this rabbi, he's an American, and with the most extreme Zionists in the United States, including Caroline Glick, which is another. These are real extremists. Even by American Ben Shapiro standards, people like Caroline Glick, who's a regular on Bannon's show, they are real extremists. They just don't think Palestinians are. It's not just that they don't exist. They exist, and they're terrorists. That's a Palestinian equals a terrorist. That's the view of the likes of Caroline Glick. So Bannon goes along with all of that. And so you think, well, okay, where's your America first? Well, there isn't. He doesn't like Ukraine. That's true. He doesn't like Ukraine. But that's only because he sees it as Biden's war. He's as much a Russophobe as anyone else. Says absolutely ridiculous things and ignorant, stupid things about Russia. Just keeps saying Putin is KGB, Putin's KGB, Putin's a really bad guy, and whatever. He keeps repeating that. So why is he so against the war in Ukraine? Well, because it's Biden's war. It's just a way of scoring political points against the Democrats. So there's nothing America first about it. And so the point you made. I imagine, as Marx, you heard the same thing I did, which was this rabbi with with just, I mean, uh, declaring that somehow, Egypt, it's all Egypt's fault, as the plight of the Palestinians, because Egypt is somehow obligated to take them. So Israel gets to bomb away, bomb and kill as many Palestinians as it likes, but the fault is Egypt's for keeping the barrier closed. And this rabbi, he speaks for many American Israel fans. Somehow Israel is always the innocent party here, and the real villains are the Arabs. It's all the terrible things that happen to the Palestinians. It's all the Arabs. It's all the fault of the Arabs. Anyway, DJ53144 says the bottom line is that no one will do anything, no matter what Israel and the U.S. does, because there's nothing that anyone can do short of nuclear war. Huh. All right. As I say, I don't think this Trumpian plan is going to get anywhere. I think it's a negotiating ploy on Trump's part, and I'm not saying it's going to succeed. I just think that's maybe what's going on in Trump's mind. I'm just speculating here, but I don't think it's going to succeed. But that's what he's thinking. He's not really. He doesn't really think that somehow you can remove 1.7 million people just like that. It's just it's insane even to think about this. And then so Kick 567 says, so why did Netanyahu send money to Hamas? He sent money to Hamas, well, because that was part of the long-standing Israeli policy of supporting Hamas against Fatah. So Fatah, which was the kind of the secular movement of the Palestinians, which is led by Yasser Arafat, the PLO, and they acquired a certain reputation and standing in the world, and that was a problem for Israel because suddenly, it became clear that they were quite reasonable. That whole Palestinian equals terrorist formula that Israel has been peddling really since forever, but particularly since 1970, and again the rise of Black September, and that was people around the world accepted this. Well, yeah, Palestinians, they're terrorists. They're the people who go around hijacking planes, and that worked for a while for Israel. Okay, Palestinians, they're just terrorists. Of course, Israel goes around killing them. I mean, what would you do with a terrorist? And so that worked until the 1980s, and gradually, it became clear that the Palestinians were prepared to accept the state of Israel, but they did want something in return. They did want some kind of self-determination or whatever of their own. Even the Reagan peace plan of 1982 envisaged some form of self-determination for the Palestinians. I mean, admittedly, it was done in conjunction with Jordan. It was somehow, they brought the Jordan formula back. King Hussein would be nominally in charge of the Palestinians, but nonetheless, I mean, the Reagan peace plan did envisage some self-determination for the Palestinians. That was 1982. So already then, the beloved Israeli formula, Palestinians equals terrorism, that was failing. I mean, if even Ronald Reagan talked about Palestinian self-determination, then you know that you're failing. And of course, that meant Yasser Arafat. And again, remember, it was the Americans who facilitated the departure of the PLO from Lebanon, and again in 1982. So that was why Israel needed somebody else, some other a faction to take on the Palestinians. So, I mean, to take on the PLO, and hence the birth of Hamas. And they were, hey, this is clever. We're going to have these Islamists, and then the Islamists and the secularists, they're going to be fighting among themselves, and that'll be very good for us. And besides, they're Islamists, and the West, the secular West, will feel generally uncomfortable with Islamic extremism, and so that was why Israel, and it wasn't just Netanyahu, it's a long-standing policy of supporting the Islamist opposition to the secular Fatah movement. It was always, they did not like, the PLO, they didn't like Arafat. And the most serious problem for Israel, was the Madrid Conference. The Madrid Conference in 1991, and that was organized by the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, was an absolute disaster for Israel, because the Palestinians were there, and they all came across as very reasonable. And these were all people who were associated with Fatah. They came to Madrid, and they spoke very calmly. They were very reasonable, and their demands were, obviously, we want self-determination with a state of our own. Israel hadn't counted on this. They just, because Israel just continues to say that they're all terrorists. We can't deal with them; they're terrorists. And so, well, you try to create that reality. Hey, look at Hamas. Hamas, well, they're terrorists, they're Islamists, they're terrorists. So that's why they supported Hamas, and they're still talking in terms of they're all terrorists. Well, that, like this rabbi guy and this Mark Levin and all these awful people. So anyway, Marx 2023 says John Helmer was on Dialogue Works. He said Putin was too close to Israel. Unfortunately, he's right. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, which is that Putin is very pro-Israel. I mean, there's no question that he has been very. I think he's philo-Semitic and all the various pronouncements that he's made over the years. I mean, people look back. I mean, he's talked about it himself, growing up in Leningrad, all the Jewish friends that he had in Leningrad, and he talks about Israel almost like an offshoot of Russia, given the so many of the citizens of Israel, their country of origin is Russia. So throughout this fighting, since October the 7th, he has never really been in any, never taken any view that somehow Israel is in the wrong, that somehow he has not tried to galvanize world opinion against Israel. This is nothing like what the Soviet Union used to do. Remember, the Soviet Union was really the leader of the world opposition to Israel. The Soviet Union was the leader of the creation of the international consensus, which was the two-state solution. And that goes all the way back to the 1970s. Again, this was a serious problem for Israel, going back to what I was saying, and that was the international consensus. And the Soviet Union was very much, articulated that. The Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations with Israel after the 1967 war, and did not restore diplomatic relations until Um, I think was one of Gorbachev's last acts. I think it was still Gorbachev that restored diplomatic relations. And but we haven't had anything. We haven't seen any move by Russia to make clear that this is horrific. What's going on in Gaza, and that it's absolutely unacceptable to to pursue what is essentially a kind of a violent I mean, I don't want to use the word genocide, but a campaign of extermination um, against the Palestinians. So we haven't any of that uh, that kind of movement from Russia, which I think you should have had. I mean, given Lavrov, who's always talking about how we've got all these friends in the global South, we've got all these friends in the global majority, and they're all with us, and we're the champions of the former colonies, the resistance to Western imperialism, and we were the in the forefront of the fight against apartheid, and we were in the forefront of the fight against colonialism, and all this stuff, which Lavrov goes on about. Well, that's fine. What are you doing about right now? Instead of basking in the glory of the Soviet era, what are you doing right now about what's happening in Gaza? And they haven't done that, and they haven't put together any kind of a coalition of powers and insisting on a peace plan, even if a peace plan would be rejected by the Americans. Well, what do they can say, well, what do you care about the Americans? Put forward your own peace plan and say, here, this is Russia, China. This is our peace plan for Gaza. Russia, China, Iran. You can put together all those global South states, those allies of yours, and say, yeah, well, this is our peace plan. Indonesia, get them all on board and say, this is what we want to do in Gaza. But we haven't had any of that from Moscow. This would have been a perfect opportunity, precisely because the West has been mobilizing this anti-Russian feeling in the world, trying to do it over Ukraine. Then this will be your opportunity to do the countervailing thing, which is to put forward a peace plan for Gaza, and condemn the Western powers for facilitating this campaign of extermination. But that hasn't happened, and why hasn't it happened? Well, because Russia is very close to Israel, and Russia just doesn't want to lose its alliance with Israel. So again, there's a lot of theater involved, condemning Netanyahu or whatever. But in the end, Russia hasn't done anything. I mean, just in the same way that Erdogan hasn't done anything, Turkey hasn't done anything. I'm not singling out Russia here, but nonetheless, it's very much in marked contrast to the Soviet era. Marty, always very good to see you. Merry Thursday, George and Gagglers. Woof woof. Yeah, thank you very much for your generosity. The dogs will appreciate you. They don't appreciate me, but they will appreciate you. And thank you, Marty, for posting some documentary material about the Paris, the Four Power Paris talks. The Four Power Conference are in Paris in May 1960, because I was talking about it during the last live stream, and that I wanted, because I thought Marty was just a genius at unearthing amazing footage, that when he can unearth footage of Khrushchev's extraordinary news conference. I mean, there's never been any news conference like this, because he was so angry about the the America resuming the U-2 spy flights after Eisenhower had promised that there wouldn't be any more U-2 spy flights, and the Americans restarted them on the eve of this four-power conference in Paris. And Khrushchev went there. Khrushchev demanded that Eisenhower apologize for these U-2 spy flights because the Russians had shot down the U-2 aircraft and had captured Gary Powers, the pilot. And so initially Eisenhower had denied about the U-2 spy flights, but once they captured Gary Powers, I mean, he couldn't very well deny it. Anyway, Khrushchev was so angry about this that he stormed out of this conference. But before he left for Moscow, he held this news conference in which he went absolutely crazy, attacking just about everyone, obviously attacking the Americans, but then he attacked these German journalists, and these German journalists were kind of heckling him. I mean, they were booing him and heckling him, and he was enraged by these Germans, and started yelling at them, and then he made this this threat, which I talked about the other day, when he said, you know what we do. He said, let me tell you, you German bastards. You know what we do to a cat who gets into the pigeon cote. We pick the cat up by the tail and we bash his head against the ground. That was his comment to the German journalists. It's quite extraordinary that you talk in these terms about you grab a cat by the tail and bash his head against the ground. I mean, it's not exactly a way to win over people to your cause, but it worked in the sense that it made Khrushchev a quite terrifying figure. I mean, just you're talking like this to journalists. It's like, this is not someone you mess with. And if you recall, the following year, he met. Eisenhower was now replaced by JFK. He met JFK in Vienna just after the Bay of Pigs debacle. And he succeeded in intimidating JFK. I mean, again, he did his usual aggressive, common man approach, and JFK was just nonplussed. He didn't know how to deal with it. So this persona, and I'm sure that's pretty close. I don't think it was not a fake persona, but this global persona that he created worked for the Soviet Union. It served to frighten countries. They didn't know what was the Soviet Union going to do. What's he going to do in Berlin? And that's there didn't know what he was going to do in Berlin. So, but anyway, I brought this up because I've always been looking for that the footage of that conference, news conference in Paris, and you can find bits of it on YouTube, and Marty posted that, but I haven't been able to find the one about the cat. You pick the cat up by the tail and bash his head against the ground. I mean, that really went beyond anything that anyone could dream of. So, but anyway, thank you, Marty, for posting those documentaries. Anyway, R. Brown 58 says DJT is proposing a non-murderous form of ethnic moving. Dealmakers' use of leverage and opening gambit to get an acceptable outcome, which is almost always different than their opening position. Trump's right that no prior idea has worked. If Palestinians have to go back to Gaza, no matter what, then you get back to one side or the other gets eliminated. That's back to square one, which the Israelis won't go along with. Well, I agree with you that, as I was saying earlier, I think that the Trump's idea is to get some kind of a deal off the ground. That's his yes, opening gambit, he's going to try and terrify the the Arabs, saying, "Hey, I'm seriously thinking about this," and then he's going to try and see if they can. Okay, obviously they don't want that, but maybe they'll settle for something that so far they haven't agreed to do, which is, hey, maybe they'll take over the Gaza, which they don't want to do. Maybe they'll sign on to the Abraham Accords that goes for Saudi Arabia. So that's I think Trump's thinking. I don't think it's going to work, but I think that's the way he thinks. You're right to saying, well, nothing has worked in the past. True, but things could be worse. Yes, the previous ideas haven't worked, but this solution, that's going to make things worse. And things can always be worse. However terrible the plight of the Palestinians has been, it could be worse. The wars and the instability in the Middle East have been terrible. I mean, this has gone on for decades, but it could be worse. And I think that's why, I mean, that's all very well, think out of the box, do something different. Yeah, you can do something different and have an almighty, cataclysmic war on your hands in the Middle East. So, I don't think this is going to work. But yeah, I mean, I think he does like to make these bold moves, thinking outside the box and so on. But in the past, he's backed down. He likes to talk big, but he tends to back down. He is a pragmatic person. I mean, he is a businessman. He's not ideological. He doesn't really want a war. He doesn't really want the the enactment of an apocalyptic scenario. He doesn't want it. Now there are people around him, and there are plenty of people in the United States, the Zionist or Christian evangelical lobby, who would very much like to see a kind of the apocalyptic scenario, a final solution to the Palestinian problem. He doesn't, because that's going to be on his watch, and he's going to have to carry the burden of that. So he doesn't really want to do that. I think he just, hey, he likes to control the news cycle. He likes to frighten others and get everyone nervous and chattering. But he is, I think, a deal maker. I think that's his that's his instinct. So I don't think he's going to go along with any final solution. And then Brown goes on. It's like the Ukrainians wanting a ceasefire and return of all territories pre-February 2022, plus Odessa. The Russians won't, nor should they do that. Likewise, the Israelis won't return Gaza. Let's be grateful for a new dynamic and praise it works better than all the other plans. Well, I mean, that's an interesting analogy, but if one thinks about, Israel really doesn't have the means of occupying Gaza for any protracted period of time. It's too small a country. You just, it's a huge undertaking to occupy Gaza, and Israel doesn't have the means to drive out the Palestinians. I mean, it's just mind-boggling even to think about it. 1.8 million, 2 million, or whatever. What is involved in driving 2 million people, women, children, elderly, the sick, the crippled, everything, driving them all out, and no one's going to take them. I mean, it's beyond the capabilities of Israel. So when you say, well, Israel isn't going to return Gaza, okay, so what's the alternative? Israel's going to run Gaza? How can he run Gaza? How can he do that? With what? With whom? This is a population that absolutely loathes the Israelis. They don't have the means to run it. Now that's, I think, different from Ukraine, because those territories that Russia has incorporated, those are pretty much inhabited by Russians and people who identify with Russia, Russian language, Russian culture. Then Russians aren't ruling over an alien population. If Russia would try to take over Ukraine and try to rule the whole of Ukraine, I mean, that would be a complete fiasco. That Russia wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, toppling the Zelensky government, I think that was doable back in 2022, and then installing some, satellite regime in Kiev. I think that was a plan. Would have been nice if it had worked. It didn't work, so you're gonna have to go to phase two. But in terms of holding on to those oblasts, which is Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, well, I mean, as I said before, I mean, Russia's still some way from taking those four territories. It hasn't even taken Donetsk, and certainly hasn't taken Kherson and Zaporozhye. But at least I think that would be feasible. Incorporating them within the Russian Federation would be feasible. There would obviously be Ukrainians who wouldn't want to be a part of that, but they probably can be bought out. That would still be, within Russia's capabilities. Anyone who doesn't want to live here, doesn't want to be a part of the Russian Federation, could just offer them a lump sum and they can go somewhere else and move back to Ukraine or whatever. So that would be doable. Running Gaza, I mean, it's just not doable, and that's why Netanyahu has failed to come up with any kind of a long-term agenda. I mean, what are you going to do with Gaza? I mean, you obviously can't run it. You don't want Hamas there. You don't want the Palestinian Authority there. Yeah, you'd love to, just will the Palestinians away. Just that so they're not there anymore. You close your eyes and they're not there anymore. But that would require an undertaking that just simply is beyond Israel's capabilities. And again, if one thinks about the closest analogies, when the Germans were driven out of Eastern Europe in 1945, they could just be picked up. First of all, no one cared about them. They could be picked up and dumped inside Germany. So you're something like 15 million Germans, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, in the Baltic states. They were just picked up, lock, stock, and barrel, and dumped into Germany. But Germany wasn't a sovereign entity, so Germans weren't in a position to object to suddenly having 15 million Germans dumped there. And of course, these Germans were, their property, everything was seized, no compensation at all. This was collective punishment. They hadn't done anything. They weren't responsible for Hitler. This was collective punishment against the civilians, but nobody cared. That was 15 million, and that was in 1945. If we look back on it now, it's absolutely horrific, but at the time, no one really cared. But that would be the closest analogy to the case of the Palestinians. You would have to pick them up and dump them, but dump them where? So that's why I don't think it's feasible. DJ says Trump is merely playing a role in the great bullfighter while he relies on his clowns to keep the other bulls from coming up from behind him. He waves his red tie and everyone responds with "Olay." All right. Yeah, maybe. I think he is I think that's the way he's thinking. Um, whether it succeeds, that's a different issue. And Brown says the UN is a feckless, pointless institution for all the reasons you state. The great powers always ignore international resolutions that challenge their ability to do what they want to do. Yeah, I agree, and I think that's the case, and that's why the UN, in a way, there's no reason to get rid of it. If for any reason the UN became a serious body, in other words, if it actually did something um, to challenge the prerogatives of the great powers, then the great powers would walk away, and that would be the end of the United Nations. But because the great powers are confident that the United Nations isn't going to uh, interfere with their vital national interests, there's no harm in continuing with the process. But that was my objection to Lavrov, is that Lavrov doesn't seem to grasp this point, and instead he kind of elevates and makes a fetish of the UN Charter. And but the UN Charter is there, and but it's honored more in the breach than in its observance. And Marx 2023 says the trouble with America is they have all become casinos. The day of the industrialists are over. Now it is crypto. That's why they will not win the trade war with China. All those pens Trump is signing, his executive orders are made in China. I don't really see that. I think America is in a much stronger economic position than China is. America is just a much bigger, much more powerful economy. So I think China, I think, is very dependent on international trade, which means that if America really wanted to apply pressure on China, I think it can do so, and I think China would cave, and that's why I think you can see even now with the tariffs that it's retaliated against the United States. They're very modest, and then do not want to get themselves involved in a trade war with China. Um, Kick567 says, I was happy when George cleared up the Professor John Mearsheimer's theory that Ukraine should have never have given up its nuke. Ukraine never had a nuclear code. Yeah, that's exactly the thing that he keeps talking about that Ukraine had nuclear weapons, and it's nonsensical. It's like saying that Belgium has nuclear weapons, Turkey has nuclear weapons, Germany has nuclear weapons. It's not. They were simply on the territory of Ukraine, but they were under the command of Russia. I mean, originally they were under the command of the Soviet armed forces, but since Russia was the successor state to the Soviet Union, they were under Russian control. Ukraine never had any control of these nuclear weapons. So it's highly misleading on Mearsheimer's part to say that Ukraine had nuclear weapons. Ukraine didn't have nuclear weapons, because then you'd have to say Belgium has nuclear weapons, which it doesn't. So. Vic Shakapopoulos says, Dear George, are you following the latest developments in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Looks like the eternal Kagame is about to score a major win for his friends. Not sure who exactly, but I bet the Western corporations or the Chinese or both. No, I think that's right. I agree with you. Kagame is, of course, a long-standing Western creature. Is the president of Rwanda, and of course, thanks to Kagame, much of the West bought into the phony baloney story of the genocide against the Tutsis, and that somehow Kagame, a Tutsi, saved his people from complete annihilation. The story was a crock from start to finish. It's not what happened. Kagame almost certainly was the one who triggered the civil war in Rwanda, because he who under the sponsorship of Museveni of Uganda, launched an invasion of Rwanda. I mean, basically, the Tutsis, the minority, had run Rwanda ever since when the Belgians gave up their empire. So basically, they were running it, but eventually the Hutus, who were the majority, they took this over. Naturally, the Tutsis were not very happy with it, and hence this invasion that was launched by Kagame. And none of that would have been a problem, um, except for the sort of the shooting down of the plane in 1994 with uh, the president, the Hutu president of Rwanda, and the Hutu president of Burundi, who were on the plane. And all of that has been, been suppressed, but clearly people who have investigated said, yeah, of course, this plane with the two Hutu presidents was shot down by Kagame's forces. And that kind of created this turmoil in Rwanda, because basically the Hutus became terrified that the Tutsis were coming back and they were going to once again rule over them. And then this was, of course, exploited by creating the story of the genocide of the Tutsis. Look, there was terrible killings on both sides. On both sides, there's no evidence that there was a genocide against the Tutsis. There was a civil war, and Kagame, with Western support, won out. But the story that was being told over the years was somehow that this was the result, that somehow he came and he rescued the Tutsis from genocide. It's completely untrue. A very, very good book on this subject by Edward Herman, specifically on what really happened in Rwanda. So, but Kagame, he enjoyed Western support. He was trained. He got his military training in the United States. So he was always America's man. Now, he doesn't have enlightened views on LGBTQ issues. Neither did Museveni of Uganda, and that was a bit of a problem with the Biden administration. It's not a problem with Trump. The fact that Rwanda doesn't support gay marriage, and Uganda, doesn't want gay rights parades in Kampala, but so that Blinken and Biden, they weren't happy with that. That was the one time that Kagame somehow fell out of favor briefly in Washington, but that's not going to be a problem with Trump. So he's shown himself to be a very skilled operator. So I would expect him to be quite skilled in Congo. Marx 2023 says George is an encyclopedia on the great Stalin, the best leader in Russian history. Well, again, he was certainly a very, certainly a cruel leader. There's no question. The record is, and that under his rule, many people died. A lot of it is to do with the Bolshevik ideology, and the Bolshevik ideology was, of course, in many ways catastrophic. And the collectivization of agriculture was an absolutely insane notion, and led to the deaths of many, and the destruction of Soviet agriculture. It's now recovered from that, but but that was the Bolshevik ideology. Now, however, if you measure Stalin's as a leader, then you say, well, here's the Soviet Union, when Stalin takes over as leader in 1925, weak, vulnerable, a divided leadership, unsure which way to go. Um, and then when he dies, 1953, the Soviet Union dominates Europe, terrifying much of the world, um, and clearly is now a nuclear power, huge armed force that everybody's, particularly in Europe, are afraid of. Well, you say, okay, this was the time when you took over. This is where you are when you die, and by that measure, you say, well, he was a successful leader. And that's how you measure a successful leader. Is the country stronger at the end of your reign than it was at the beginning? In Stalin's case, there's just no two ways about it. And you'd have to you're going to have to always judge it on other leaders, Gorbachev or Yeltsin, and then we can then measure. Well, were you a successful leader or not a successful leader? Um, R. Brown says the Hitler comparisons reveal a complete inability to make compelling intellectual arguments. MAGA is not Deutschland über alles. Absolutely agree. But again, as I say, I think there's always a misunderstanding in thinking that Deutschland über alles has anything to do with Hitler. It has nothing to do with Hitler. It long predates that slogan. In fact, it comes from a poem. It predates Hitler. It had nothing to do with Hitler. It's part of the national anthem, but that's a different issue. It used to be a part of the national anthem, but again, it wasn't Hitler who made it a part of the national anthem. It's not part of the national anthem anymore. They're not allowed to sing those words. But no one thought back in the day when it was a part of the national anthem that somehow it was in the Deutschland über alles meant somehow Germany ruling over other peoples. It just simply says Germany above everything else. I mean, for Germans, Germany obviously means more to Germans than any other country. Well, which kind of what you would expect. But anyway, the point is that people, lazily always assume that Deutschland über alles has something to do with Hitler. Anyway, it says the legitimate purpose of every nation state is to advance the interests of its people. I agree. Trump, unlike the fascist EU rules-based order crowd, doesn't see war or want war to advance U.S. interests. He'll use economic leverage, which is different than launching a 5 million man army against all his neighbors. Well, I think economic, but I don't think we can rule out Trump using force. He certainly hasn't himself ruled out using force. What I think Trump would do, and where I think Trump is much better than Biden and Blinken, I think Trump would use force where success is guaranteed, and that's kind of what the more effective presidents had done in the past. Whether we would think about the wars that America had waged, the Spanish-American War, or the wars in Haiti or Nicaragua, back in the day, and of course again Reagan's wars, Eisenhower, when Eisenhower used force. You use it against smaller and weaker states. Success is guaranteed, and that's kind of how you have to do it. What you don't do is what Biden did, which is you get yourself into a very nasty confrontation, unnecessarily so, with another great power. That way disaster beckons. And I think that's why the shrewdest American leaders avoided getting themselves into wars with other great powers. Like a Spanish-American War, the Americans knew perfectly well they were going to defeat Spain. So that I think, and Trump I think is in that tradition. the same Eisenhower did the same thing. Like intervention in Lebanon, but Eisenhower always used American force in a very restrained way. He avoided um, getting involved in entangling wars, and wars in which America becomes you know you know dangerously vulnerable. So Eisenhower avoided the mistakes of Kennedy and Johnson, who escalated American involvement. So he was, it was a limited involvement in Vietnam, and I think Trump is in that tradition. I think he's in the tradition of use American force, but use it in a relatively restrained way. Don't get yourself into any situation where you become vulnerable. Um, Kick 567. I owe George $10. My mom has my car tomorrow. George, I promise 100%. Okay, great. Thank you so much. But as I say, I mean, the money goes to the dogs. It doesn't go to me. So always remember. So that's let me go back where we were, and yeah, wow. So anyway, Kick said, George, is the heating bill still not so in Hungary? Unfortunately, that is the case. The heating bill, I don't understand, to be honest, how they calculate it. They kind of give you an average over the year, and then that's your, so you pay um, every month according to this, what they think is your average. And so you pay, and think, oh, that's not too bad. That's not too bad. But once the winter comes and your heating is much greater than what they deem is your average, because it's every month you're paying the same thing, irrespective of what's, what, and boom, boom, boom. But when it's much greater than the average, which obviously it is in December and January, they punish you. They don't just bill you for whatever it is in December and January. They absolutely punish you. It's at a much higher rate. You're charged at a much higher rate than you are at other months of the year. So suddenly it hits you and say, "Wow, where the hell did this come from?" So that's why it's just, it adds to your feelings of gloom in the winter when you stare at this bill and say, what the hell is this? Um, and Mark says that George, pig ears for dogs have doubled in price since COVID-19, which is not good for the tip jar. I think so, and that's, I think, you've taken the words out of the dog's mouth. You say, yeah, you know, this tip jar situation is very dire because people are not taking into account inflation. How the hell are we going to afford the pig's ears if there's nothing in the tip jar? I mean, that's exactly their point. Yeah, they're very expensive, and the tips are not coming in at the rate that's taking into account inflation. They're very unhappy, and they take it out on me. Anyway, Kick says, I posted a photo of Tulsi with Rabbi Shmuley hugging each other. Yes. No, I think that's quite a disgusting sight. Um, yeah, I mean, being there. I mean, it's one thing to have a kind of confirmation conversion when you go there, and then you have to kowtow to the senator. So when she said, "Oh yeah, I'm happy now with the changes made to Section 702 of FISA," you have to say, "All right, there was no way in the world she was going to get through that confirmation without saying, 'I'm happy with 702,' and basically saying that uh, that uh, that so that's that was a real, because if she hadn't said that, And then said, "Oh, Snowden is a terrible person." I mean, she didn't call him a traitor, which is what they wanted him to say, that oh, he's a traitor. She didn't say that, but yeah, terrible person, everything terrible. She had to do this, because there's no other way that she would have got through the confirmation. The Republicans insisted that she does this. She goes along with it, and then they'll all support her, and they did. But there's no excuse for hugging Rabbi Shmuley. I mean, that's I mean, spending any time with Rabbi Shmuley, I think is a horrible activity. Anyway, DJ says, I don't know where I heard it, but I heard that they renamed it Fauci 19 in honor of its creator. Not even Hitler or Stalin had a disease named after him. Fauci 19. Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, was it Trump used to say about the China virus? He kept calling it the China virus. And then it was the reporter asked, why do you keep calling it the China virus? And then you say, because it comes from China, because it came from China. So yeah, but he called it the China virus. So yeah. Anyway. And then Robert says, I wonder if the nation state really has the best interest of its people at heart, or whether the true concern of the nation state isn't the state itself. Take Ukraine. Zelensky is perfectly willing to send armed gangs to kidnap tens of thousands of his own people, hand them a rifle, ship them off to certain deaths on the front lines, and shoot them if they try to surrender or flee. Isn't that the case to varying degrees with every other nation state? Well, you have a good point there. It's when you have these nation states or any states. I mean, we don't have to talk about the nation state. I mean, to the extent that we can identify a state with a nation, because nearly always other other minorities or whatever were living in there. But any state, you really have to wonder: are they pursuing policies that do anything for the people that they're asking to fight their wars for them? The rulers they're asking to fight their wars for them. I mean, like if you look at the Great War, the World War One, which was just horrific. I mean, you're talking millions and millions and millions of men who were killed. But what the hell were they killed for? I mean, throughout the war, none of the leaders who were leading their countries in that war could articulate any reasonable, achievable, rational goals that they were seeking to accomplish. So when Woodrow Wilson, I think it was about 1916, he asked all of the leaders, can you write down on a piece of paper what exactly are your wartime goals? They had difficulties coming up with it. Though, of course, that didn't stop Wilson from, eventually intervening himself in this war, even though, again, there was no rational set of goals that Wilson could articulate for how Americans would in any way benefit from taking part in this war. So you're right. I mean, how has anything that Ukraine done benefited Ukrainians? I mean, the deal that was on offer from the Russians was a very reasonable one. It wasn't particularly good for Russia, but it was a very reasonable deal. I mean, we're talking about Minsk, the Minsk Accords, again, very reasonable. The Istanbul Accords were very reasonable. What kind of a leadership rejects that and then presides over the deaths of whatever hundreds of thousands of people? I mean, it's just mind-boggling. So I don't think it's a matter of nation states. I don't think it's a matter of democracy. I think it's unfortunately it's terrible rulers, who lead their country to disaster. Now the Americans are shrewder than that. And the British are quite shrewd, which is you get other people to do your fighting for you. And that, it's cynical, it's cruel, it's in every way despicable, but it's quite effective because at least, hey, we're not the ones who are dying, somebody else is dying. But there's no excuse for the Ukrainians. It's like, but you're the one who's dying. It's not the Americans who are dying. It's not the British who are dying. It's you. You are dying. That's a bad deal. That's not a good deal for your own people. Um. Anyway, so then Kick 567 says Tulsi is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Psychological Program. She is Rabbi Shmuley's best goy friend. Oh God. Admiral Morrison, son Jim Morrison, the first martyr to rock and roll, headed to Cold War program. Most rock groups, CIS or CIS created. I guess CIA created. Um, yeah, CIA created. Okay, Marx 2023. Trump's art of the deal is blackmail. Yeah, I think, or at least extortion. And yeah, that's it. So, um, Anne Marie, thank you very much. It's very good to see you. And Anne Marie says, "Good evening, George and Gagglers. I finally left a comment on Nielsen. I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to read it immediately after um, after this podcast, and then but I really appreciate appreciate your generosity, and I appreciate your comment. It's you always have very interesting things to say about music. I think you have a much deeper knowledge of music than I have, so I'm really looking forward to reading it. And Kick 567 says Whitney Webb did a deep dive about Tulsi and her Zionist obedience, and when RFK Jr. was called an anti-Semite, Rabbi Shmuley came to the rescue, and the two marched off down Broadway. Yeah, yeah. um, the RFK conversion to Zionism, if it is a conversion, it was always puzzled me a bit. I'd have to look into it, how that came about. I mean, there are people who just simply say, the man just has no firm set of beliefs. He just grabs onto whatever's going, and then and he's equally committed to one set of views when he was committed to the exact opposite set of views just a few weeks ago. So I don't know to what extent he really believes this crap that he peddles now about Israel, or whether it's just simply political opportunism. This was the way forward for him. Um, but yeah, I mean, but it is quite disgusting. Again, hanging out with Rabbi Shmuley, that's not a good look. But you're right. I mean, it happened when he was suddenly accused of anti-Semitism, and boom. How do you deal with that issue? Well, you come out. You're more pro Israel than the next guy. Who's that guy used to be? What's his name? Pat Robertson. Remember Pat Robertson? He was that evangelical pastor who was quite involved in Republican politics in the 80s and 90s, and he came under attack for anti-Semitism, but he dealt with the issue by bringing up his ardent, passionate commitment to Israel, and that worked for him. That so all the attacks of anti-Semitism disappeared. And I remember, I think Norman Podhoretz wrote something about Pat Robertson, defending Pat Robertson from all the anti-Semitism slurs. No. He's a good, loyal champion of Israel. And I think he said his last sentence, "I wish I could say the same about the other Pat." That was his last sentence. I wish I could say the same about the other Pat. And the other Pat he referred to was Pat Buchanan. And Pat Buchanan, you have to say, to his credit, and he was strongly attacked for anti-Semitism. To his credit, he never embraced the cause of Israel. Um, and all right, so then, all right, we have. Kick says, oh no, the Marks 2023 says, George, your EU tribunal post was excellent. The EU is run by dangerous ideologue clowns. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And then NKMRD says, one can see that the chaos, desperation, crime that came up when the war ended still has effects today. Many families in Europe have their old war and occupation stories, and many are very tough. It still affects how people see events today. I think that's a very good point. What I think is interesting is that, you know, we look back upon it now in retrospect, and these events were so enormous, but the people who lived through it themselves, they kind of, boom, they were on to the next thing. It's like they didn't spend their time talking about all the things that they'd lived through. It was you're dealing with the next set of problems. So I mean, like I as a child, I was in Hungary. It was only a few years before that there was the whole the mass mass move to Auschwitz. All the Jews from Hungary were moved to Auschwitz, but no one talked about it. No, I lived there. It was Hungary, nice place. No one really talked about what happened just a few years ago. The Jews were shipped en masse to Auschwitz. And the same things again for my parents. They lived in the Soviet Union during the war. They told interesting stories, and so on. But then you think, I mean, yeah, but these horrific things were going on around you. Yeah, but we're kind of busy with this and busy with that. We're moving on to the next thing. So in a way, we look back now into the magnitude of these events have grown over the years, much more so than the people in the who kind of took part in it themselves and then lived on after the war. They were still quite young, they had to get on with their lives. They couldn't spend their time thinking about what happened in the past. They had to think about the future. Raising families, getting jobs, and all the other things that you're supposed to do. So it's kind of an interesting thing that the magnitude of events actually grows the further away you get from them, and the fewer of the people who actually took part in those events are alive. There are now hardly anyone alive who has a living memory of World War II. I mean, it's just, let alone took any kind of an active part in that, and whoever kind of any also memories of the terrible things that happened. Anyway, George, the Chinese economy is many times bigger than America's GDP. Is a fool's game. Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, if you have China has a population about 1.5 billion. You multiply 1.5 billion by anything, you get a very big number. It doesn't really mean very much. China is a population which is 4 or 5 times the size of America's population. So obviously you're going to have a bigger economy. I mean, if you have 4 or 5 times the number of people, there's going to be a lot more economic activities. But that isn't really a measure of anything, because I mean, if you look at per capita GDP, I mean, China is way down. I mean, I don't know what number it is. I mean, maybe number 20 or maybe even below that. But I don't necessarily think per capita GDP is a particularly useful measure. I think what matters ultimately is your economic power, and and what you produce. And the strategic products that you produce. Then you can start comparing who has the stronger economy. But I don't think that measuring the size of an economy really gets you very far. Okay. And then Mark says the rest of the world is getting a bad deal from America. That's Mark saying, accepting those fake dollars that America prints and buys some other country's hard work. Yeah, that comes from the prerogative of being the reserve currency. No question. That's it. And that's the deal that everybody signs on to, and they are getting a bad deal with particularly when America runs inflation and basically you're getting dollars that are going down in value. Um, and then Vic Shakopoulos says, just wanted to point out Kagame's proxies are overrunning Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. In the last weeks, they've captured lots of ground. It's all about some minerals, of course. Maybe they will compensate if the West gives up on the Ukrainian ones. I mean, I don't think so, um, but yeah, this has been going on for some time. This war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's all about the strategic minerals. I doubt whether it's going to be part of any grand bargain. Um, and so let me. What's it? I was something. I missed. Yeah, Judy, thank you so much. We always appreciate your generosity. So really, uh, yeah, Judy who says, appreciate your analysis of Lavrov. Thank you so. Really, really, that's very kind of you to say so, Judy. And again, thank you so much for your generosity. And we have, okay, I think. And then, Brown, thank you for your tip. I appreciate that. I'm an American, but I hope that BRICS model drives the U.S. to reform its lack of financial discipline. I go along with that. I agree with that. I think we're some way off from that. Love to see it happen, but we're away from that yet. But anyway, thank you everybody for joining me. Thank you so much for all of your comments and questions. And thank you above all to everybody who has contributed to the tip jar. I'm going to have to go hat in hand to those ferocious hounds tomorrow and tell them again, I did my best. I mean, I can't do more than that. And, they'll do their usual thing is, yeah, that's kind of what's worrying us. That's your best. But anyway, that's a regular thing. But thank you so much. We'll do our podcast over the weekend, and then Monday. Let's hope Monday some of the technical issues will be sorted out. Monday we're going to do our live stream with Peter 10 a.m. Eastern time, and then next Tuesday I'll do my solo 3 p.m. usual time. So thank you so much for today, and see you very soon. All the best. Good night. Bye-bye.